In the high valley below the Wind River foothills, in the spring of 1873, a Norwegian former ship's carpenter named Halvard Munk began digging a trench in a perfect circle around his cabin.
The storm's holding, keeps coming down.
And the men of Cutbank Crossing decided, over coffee and tobacco, that he had finally lost whatever sense the ocean had left him. He had come west 3 years before, after a decade working the timber frames and rigging of merchant vessels out of Bergen and later Boston, following a wife who wanted land instead of salt water. Ingrid Munk had died the second winter, of a fever that no one in the valley could name, and Halvard had buried her on a low rise above the cabin where the wind came down off the mountains hardest, because she had asked, before the fever took her voice, to be somewhere she could feel the weather move. He kept a brass ship's compass on the windowsill afterward, the one instrument from his old life he had not sold for seed money, and he told no one why. What the town knew of him was this: he worked alone, he spoke little, and he had a habit, inherited from 12 years reading wind in canvas and rope, of standing outside for long minutes at dusk with his face turned into the breeze, doing nothing anyone could name. They did not know that a ship's carpenter learns wind the way a farmer learns soil, not as weather, but as a force with shape, direction, and pressure that a structure either survives or does not. They knew only that his corn came up thin 2 years running, that his roof had been stripped twice by gusts that left his neighbors' roofs untouched, and that something about the way weather singled out his particular quarter section had begun to unsettle him visibly. So when the ground thawed enough to dig, Halvard did not plant a windbreak the way any homesteader in that country would have. A single row of trees on the north and west sides, the common wisdom of the region, Tier 1 fact, the standard shelter belt practice already spreading through prairie settlements by that decade. He dug a full ring, 12 feet out from his walls, and began setting spruce seedlings into it at a spacing so tight that Otto Pruitt, who ran the mercantile and considered himself an authority on most things, told him to his face that he was going to strangle his own dooryard. "You'll have no sun by August," Otto said, standing at the fence rail with his thumbs in his belt. "No garden, no light in your windows past 10 in the morning. Man needs a windbreak, fine, plant one north side like everybody does. This is a wall. You're building a wall out of trees around your own house like the whole valley's coming to burn you out." Halvard did not answer that the whole valley did not need to understand a hull to know it kept out water. He simply kept setting seedlings, one every 18 inches, working the trench in a ring that would, if it lived, close entirely around the cabin by autumn of its 3rd year, leaving only a narrow serpentine gap on the eastern side, angled so that no straight line of wind could pass through it without striking green wood first. The valley had a name for what he was doing within a month. They called it Munk's Folly, and they said it without much cruelty, mostly the tired affection people extend to a man they've decided is sad rather than dangerous. Ruth Colby, the valley's midwife, was the only one who said it to him directly, and she said it not as an insult but as a worry, because she had delivered 3 bobbies in cabins with roofs stripped by wind, and she did not like the arithmetic of a man blocking his own light in a place where light was already short 5 months of the year. "You'll starve your own garden shading it like this," she told him in June, standing at the edge of the young ring where the seedlings were still barely knee-height and offered no shade at all yet, only the suggestion of a boundary. "And you'll starve for company too, shutting yourself in behind green walls. A man alone up here already sees too little of people as it is." Halvard considered this the way he considered most things, slowly, turning it over before answering. "A garden dies in one bad season," he said. "A house that comes apart in the wind kills the people in it. I choose which thing I protect first." It was the longest sentence Ruth had heard from him since Ingrid's funeral, and she did not know what to make of it, only that there was an old grief moving under the words that she recognized and did not press. What Halvard understood, and did not explain to Otto Pruitt or anyone else in Cutbank Crossing, was something he had learned the hard way on a ship's deck off the coast of Newfoundland in a gale that nearly took the mainmast. A solid wall does not stop wind, it fights it, and wind that is fought concentrates its force at the base of whatever fights it, digging out snow, tearing at foundations, funneling around corners at speeds greater than the open wind itself. A ship's rigging did not fight wind. It bled it, spilled it sideways and upward through layers of rope and canvas until the force that reached the deck was a fraction of what struck the sails. He had watched crews lash extra canvas not to block wind, but to break it into smaller and smaller currents until it lost the coherence to do damage. A solid barrier was a single failure point. A layered, permeable one was 100 small victories stacked on top of each other. This was, he believed, exactly what a plain single-row windbreak failed to do. One row of trees, spaced the way Otto and every other homesteader in the valley spaced them, slowed wind on one side and let it reform on the other, often faster, funneled by the gap beneath the lowest branches where trunks met open ground. He had seen it happen to his own first winter's shelter belt, a single line of young cottonwoods that had done nothing to stop the gust that stripped his roof, because the wind had simply gone under the canopy and come out the other side with nowhere to spend its force but his shingles. A ring, densely packed, 3 trees deep in places, with branches interlocking low to the ground and needles catching wind at every layer instead of one. That, he believed, would not merely slow the wind. It would consume it, the way sail canvas consumed a gale, bleeding it into 100 small eddies inside the branches until what reached the cabin walls was air that had lost the will to move. He had no word for this. He would not have called it, as a man of a later century might, drag coefficient or boundary layer turbulence. He called it, in the one conversation where he tried to explain himself to Ruth, breaking the wind's back before it finds the house, and left it at that, because he did not trust himself to say more without sounding like a man talking to ghosts. His first attempt that spring was nearly a total failure, and it was a failure of material, not of idea. He had planted mostly Engelmann spruce, which he had chosen because they held their needles densely and grew reasonably fast for a conifer. But he had planted them in soil he had not tested, low ground near the cabin's north corner that held water through May and drowned nearly a third of the seedlings by June, their needles rusting orange and dropping, while healthier trees 80 feet away on drier ground thrived. He dug up the losses, amended the wet ground with gravel and ash from his stove, hauled saplings from a stand 2 miles up canyon to replace them, and lost 3 weeks of the short growing season doing it, while Otto Pruitt watched from the mercantile porch and told anyone who'd listen that the man had planted his fortress in a swamp. The second failure came in July, and it was not Halvard's error at all, but the valley's elk, who found young spruce a tender and welcome change from summer browse and stripped an entire 11-yard stretch of the eastern arc down to bare stems in a single night. Halvard woke to find the gap he had so carefully angled to slow wind reduced to a corridor of naked sticks, and for the first time since Ingrid's death, the men in town saw him do something other than work in silence. He sat on his own porch step for the better part of a morning with his head in his hands, not weeping exactly, but arrested, the way a man is arrested by a hull breach below the waterline. He solved it the way a carpenter solves most things, by building around the failure rather than mourning it. He could not fence 11 yards of ring without defeating the purpose of an unbroken barrier, so instead he wove a temporary lattice of willow branches through the damaged stems, thick enough to discourage browsing, but open enough to let light and rain through to what remained. And he replanted the gap with a mix he'd been told by a passing freighter that elk found less palatable, young Douglas fir, Tier 2 knowledge, a plausible period technique rather than a documented citation. Since no one recorded exactly what that freighter said, it held. Barely, but it held, and by August the eastern gap had begun to fill in again, thin but alive. The third failure was the one that nearly ended the project, and it was the failure Halvard should have seen coming from the start. He did not have enough trees. A ring 12 feet out from a cabin wall roughly 20 feet on a side, 3 rows deep in places, required more seedlings than one man could realistically dig, haul, and plant in a single season on land. He was also supposed to be breaking for corn and hay to survive the winter. By the time the first hard frost threatened in October, the ring was perhaps 2/3 complete, solid and thick on the north and west, where he had started, and where the worst winds historically came from, but thin, single-road and thigh-height at best on the south and southeast, where he had run out of both trees and season. Otto Pruitt, seeing the half-finished ring from the road that October, was heard to remark that Munk's fortress had more holes in it than the widow Larson's fence line, and that a man ought to know when to admit a bad idea before winter did it for him. Halvard knew the ring was incomplete. He knew it better than anyone because he had walked it every evening for 6 months, and he knew exactly which 11 yards of the southeast arc were still vulnerable, exactly which trees on the north face had grown thick enough to lace their lower branches together into what he had started to think of, privately, as a single woven wall of green rather than individual trees at all. What he did not know, because no man in that valley in 1873 had any way of knowing, was which direction the worst storm of the decade would come from, or when it would arrive, or whether the wall he had built with his own hands, against the advice of everyone who knew him, would hold long enough to matter. The blizzard that came through the valley in the third week of November arrived from the northwest, which was, in later years, the detail that made old-timers shake their heads when they told the story, because the northwest was the one direction Halvard Munk had built his ring thickest and deepest, without ever knowing why he had chosen to start there instead of anywhere else on the perimeter. He would say, years later, to the one or two people who ever asked him directly, that he had simply started digging where the ground was easiest to break, near the northwest corner where the soil ran shallow over old streambed gravel rather than the heavier clay elsewhere on the section. It was not prophecy. It was only that a man breaking new ground with a spade chooses the path of least resistance first, and the path of least resistance happened, by an accident with no meaning beyond itself, to be the direction the valley's worst weather traveled down out of the mountains. The storm had been building for 2 days before it broke, the kind of pressure drop that old cattlemen in that country claimed they could feel in old wounds and bad knees before any cloud showed itself. Halvard felt it differently, the way he had felt weather changing at sea, a particular stillness in the afternoon air, a yellow cast low on the northwestern horizon that had nothing to do with sunset, and a silence among the ravens that normally worked the tree line above his cabin. By the second evening, even Otto Pruitt, no reader of weather by trade, was boarding his mercantile windows and telling customers to get home before dark. It struck a little after 9 at night, on the 22nd of November, and within an hour the valley had lost sight of itself entirely, snow moving nearly sideways under a wind that the freighters who survived it later estimated, from the way it had flattened stands of mature lodgepole on the ridge above town, at somewhere close to 60 miles an hour, sustained, with gusts well beyond that. 2 barns went down in Cutbank Crossing that night. The Larson family's roof peeled back like the lid of a tin, and they spent the worst of the storm huddled in a root cellar dug into the hillside, which was the only structure on their property that held. A freighter named Cole Ashby, caught on the road with a wagon of feed corn, lost 2 mules to exposure before dawn and nearly lost himself, saved only by finding an overhang of rock he could wedge the wagon box against. At Halvard Munk's cabin, something different happened, and it happened in stages that he observed that night, the way a sailor reads a ship's behavior in a gale, not by looking out a window, which told him almost nothing. The glass rhymed instantly with ice, and the world beyond it reduced to a screaming gray blankness, but by listening and by feeling the structure itself through the floor and walls. The first thing he noticed, within the first quarter hour of the wind's arrival, was that the sound was wrong. Not absent, the storm was audible everywhere in the valley that night, a roar that survivors described afterward as being like standing beside a running river swollen to flood, but wrong in its character at his own walls. It did not have the sharp, close shriek of wind finding a corner or a gap, the sound he remembered from his own cabin's first winter, when every gust had announced itself at the window frames and the chimney flashing with a whistle that made sleep impossible. What he heard instead, from inside his 4 log walls, was a deeper, more distant sound, muffled, textured, more like wind, moving through a forest a quarter mile off than wind striking a structure directly. It took him nearly an hour of sitting still, hands flat on the log wall beside his bed, to understand what he was hearing. He was hearing the wind lose its fight with the trees before it ever reached the cabin at all, the same low, continuous roar of branches absorbing and redirecting force that he remembered from standing at the rail of a ship in a gale, listening to canvas do exactly this to wind that would otherwise have snapped the mast. The second thing he noticed was the absence of the particular vibration he had come to dread in his first 2 winters in that cabin, a low shudder that ran through the roof ridge pole whenever a strong gust struck the north wall directly, a vibration he had felt often enough to recognize instantly by its absence. The ridge pole that night was still. Not silent, he could feel faintly, a general tremor moving through the whole structure, the ordinary sympathetic hum of any wooden building in high wind, but nothing like the sharp, resonant shudder of a direct strike. Whatever wind was reaching his walls was reaching them diffused, broken into 100 smaller currents from 100 directions instead of one massed force from the northwest, exactly as he had gambled 8 months earlier that a layered ring of interlocking branches would do to it. The third thing, and the one that frightened him most in the moment, was the sound from the southeast, the thin, unfinished quarter of his ring, where the elk damage and the short season had left the barrier at little more than a single struggling row of young Douglas fir. Twice that night he heard, distinct from the general roar, a sharper gust find that gap and strike the corner of the cabin near his stored woodpile, hard enough that he heard something outside come loose and tumble, and hard enough that a thin, cold draft found its way, for the first time all night, through the chinking near that corner and touched the back of his neck as he sat near the stove. He understood in that moment, with the plain, unsentimental clarity of a man who has watched a ship take on water and knows exactly where the breach is, that the wall he had built was not uniform, and that the storm, indifferent to his intentions, had found the one seam he had not finished closing. He did not go outside. Going outside in that wind, in that cold, to defend an unfinished tree line would have been the act of a man choosing pride over survival, and 12 years at sea had taught him the difference between a repair worth risking your life for and one that could wait for daylight. Instead, he moved his bed-roll and the few things that mattered to him, Ingrid's shawl, the brass compass, a tin box of letters, away from that southeast corner, banked the stove as high as he dared, and sat up through the worst of the night with his back against the solid northwest wall, the wall behind the thickest, oldest, most completely woven arc of his ring, and waited. The storm did not fully break until past 4 in the morning, and it did not fully clear until midday on the 23rd, by which time the valley had begun to take stock of itself in the particular silence that follows a bad storm, a silence full of people stepping outside into snow that in places had drifted higher than fence rails, counting losses. Cutbank Crossing's losses were, by the standards of that country and that decade, severe but survivable. 2 roofs gone, 6 head of stock dead from exposure, mostly animals caught in open pasture with no windbreak worth the name. The freighter Cole Ashby's 2 mules. No human lives lost, though the Larson family had come within, by Ruth Colby's later estimation, perhaps 2 more hours of exposure in that root cellar of losing the youngest child to cold. And it was Ruth herself who said afterward that she did not want to think too hard about how close that had run. At Halvard Munk's cabin, the losses were a woodpile scattered and half-buried, a section of chinking near the southeast corner that would need repacking, and roughly 11 yards of young Douglas fir on the unfinished arc of his ring, snapped and flattened by the same gust that had found the gap in his wall and touched his neck near the stove. That was the whole of it. His roof stood untouched, every shingle in place. His chimney stood true. When Otto Pruitt walked out from town 2 days later, as much out of curiosity as neighborliness, to see what had become of Munk's Folly, he found Halvard on his knees in the snow at the base of the northwest arc of the ring, brushing accumulated snow off the lowest branches of a spruce that had grown, in 8 months, thick and dense enough that Otto could not see more than a foot or 2 into it, could not see the cabin wall behind it at all from where he stood on the road. Though the ring was barely chest height on most of its length, Otto did not say anything for a long moment, looking at the drifts piled against the outer face of the tree ring, some of them 4 feet deep, and comparing them, without needing to say so aloud, to the bare scoured ground around his own cabin in town, where the wind had found nothing to spend itself on and had instead cleared snow down to frozen earth in some places while piling it waist-deep against his walls in others. Wind still got through some of it, Halvard said before Otto could speak, nodding toward the flattened southeast arc, because he was not a man inclined to accept praise he had not fully earned. That part wasn't finished. Elk took it back in July. I heard about the elk, Otto said. He was quiet another moment, working something out behind his eyes that did not come easily to a man who had spent 7 months calling his neighbor's project a folly to anyone who'd listen. Larsons lost their roof, whole thing, peeled back like a can lid. They were in the root cellar past midnight with that baby, and Ruth says the child was blue around the mouth by the time it was over. I know. You didn't lose a shingle. Halvard straightened up from the spruce branch he'd been clearing and looked at the ring the way a shipwright looks at a hull he has just brought through weather it was built for, which is to say without much visible satisfaction, only a kind of settled private accounting. A wall that fights the wind gets torn apart by it, he said. This doesn't fight it. It just takes the wind apart piece by piece before it gets anywhere near the house. He gestured at the unfinished gap, the flattened saplings dark against the snow. Where I hadn't finished, the wind still won. Where I had, it didn't. That's the whole of it. Otto looked at the gap, and then at the dense, snow-laden green wall running unbroken for most of the ring's circumference, and did not immediately have anything to say to that. What happened over the following 2 years, though it is a smaller part of the story than the night of the storm itself, is worth setting down honestly, because it is the part that turned a single winter's vindication into something the valley actually learned from, rather than a piece of gossip that faded once the snow melted. Halvard finished the ring the following spring, using seed stock from the same up canyon stand, and this time fenced the young plantings against elk from the start rather than after the damage was done, a lesson bought at the cost of 11 ruined yards the year before. Ruth Colby, who had told him in June that he would starve his own garden, came to see the finished ring the following autumn and found, to her evident surprise, that the interior dooryard, though shaded through the deep summer months exactly as Otto had warned, held a longer growing season at both ends of the year than the open ground around it. The dense green walls trapping enough of the ground's own warmth on frosty spring, and fall nights to spare his early plantings from the light frosts that killed his neighbor's seedlings 2 and 3 weeks before his own. This was not something Halvard had planned for or claimed to understand fully. He had built the ring to break wind, and the small mercy of a longer shoulder season on either side of summer arrived as a discovery he simply noted and accepted, the way a sailor accepts a favorable current he did not create. By the 3rd year, 3 families in the valley had begun their own rings, smaller and less ambitious than Halvard's, taking cuttings from his stand rather than ordering seedlings from the territorial nursery 2 counties over. And Otto Pruitt, who never in his life offered a direct apology for anything, began referring to the practice around his own store simply as Munk's method, which was, from a man like Otto, as close to an apology as the valley was ever likely to get. Halvard Munk lived at that cabin another 11 years, until his own death in the winter of 1884, and the ring of trees around it, thickened by then into something closer to a small, dense wood than a planted hedge, was still standing, according to the account of the freighter's grandson who passed through that country decades later and wrote it down, long after the cabin itself had fallen to ruin inside it. A green wall still holding its circle around a house that no longer needed protecting. Built by a man the valley had once called foolish, for a reason none of them understood until the one night it mattered.